As we transition from the global conflict that marked Unit 7, we now approach essentially the second half of the 20th century with Cold War and decolonization. Now, American and Soviet soldiers joyfully met at the Elbe River at the end of the war. But this symbolic partnership between the liberal democracy of the United States and the communism of Far Eastern Europe would soon come to an end. Early in 1945, at the Yalta Conference on the Black Sea, which ultimately was Stalin's turf because he really didn't like to fly, Roosevelt's most pressing need was to secure Stalin's support for the founding of the United Nations. The Security Council of the UN was made up of the 5 major allies of the war: the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. And each had a veto power, so a complete consensus needed to be reached to make a decision. So ultimately, this is supposed to give it more power than the League of Nations did. Roosevelt understood that Stalin was unlikely to pull out of Eastern Europe once the war ended, and that he probably wasn't going to make good on his promises of holding free elections in Poland. So on screen, we see Prime Minister Winston Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. By the Potsdam Conference that summer, Truman had replaced Roosevelt, and Churchill was actually replaced about a week and a half into it. Now, the 3 major powers agreed on punishments for Germany, but when asked about free elections, Stalin's words were, "Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach." A very telling statement from Premier Stalin. In 1946, Winston Churchill kind of responds to these developments by giving his famed Iron Curtain speech, in which he declared that Europe had officially split in 2. Many Eastern European countries had strong communist movements that fought fascists during the war, but Stalin was uninterested in working with them. He wanted control from Moscow with the support of the Red Army. Now, while the Russians sought protection from future invasions, the Americans approached this period with the ideals of democracy and market-driven economic success. So the stage is really set for a showdown between the 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the long telegram was sent to Washington by an American diplomat in Moscow in 1946, and this long telegram advocates the policy of containment. This diplomat believed that Russian leadership was ultimately weak and insecure, so by holding firm and maintaining their unity, the Americans could probably check Soviet expansion. Thus, the Truman Doctrine was born and tested for the first time. This was first present in Greece, where a civil war had actually resumed following the end of the war. The royalist Greek forces were unable to suppress the communist forces who had fought the Germans during the war. Now they were fighting to advance socialism within the borders of Greece. The United States officially pledged to aid free peoples wherever they may be. Stalin was content to let the U.S. have this influence in Greece, and thereby the United States did not respond to Stalin's takeover of Czechoslovakia. So there's sort of this give and take that's occurring. Now, it goes without saying that Germany was the centerpiece of the Cold War. The Soviets occupied the East, while the Americans, the British, and the French divided up the West. Berlin was split into the Soviet zone and was also divided into the 4 quadrants. So even though Berlin is in East Germany, the city itself was divided up between the powers. Now, there never was an official agreement made about Germany's future because the Americans and Soviets were immediately at odds with one another after the war. In 1948, the Soviets actually cut off access to Berlin, so the United States airlifted supplies into West Berlin. This becomes known as the Berlin Airlift. It succeeded, but by the next year, Germany was split into East and West Germany. East Germany was the German Democratic Republic, and the West was the Federal Republic of Germany. Oddly enough, France and the Soviets, all right, so the French people and the Soviets people were actually okay with it because they had each been invaded by Germany twice in a generation and they were just tired of it. However, each blamed the other side for Germany's current state. Now, for one of the first times in world history, the U.S. actually took an active role in world affairs and even took the lead in reconstructing post-war Europe, with the Marshall Plan being the policy that got the most press. Truman believed that the U.S. needed to revive global trade, so rebuilding Europe was essential to American progress. Italy and France still had strong communist parties, so continued struggles there might lead to a communist takeover, right? That's the fear. The U.S., with the Marshall Plan, made $12 billion available for post-war reconstruction by early 1948. So in this sense, this truly does end the period of U.S. isolationism that you could argue goes back to the policies of President George Washington. Now, each side has their different ideas with how to move forward economically. Prior to the end of the war, the U.S. had made official plans to rebuild Europe. It created the World Bank to provide money to nations in need of a jumpstart, and the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, to provide emergency loans to nations that could become insolvent. Now, the idea behind the Marshall Plan, as well as the new Bretton Woods institutions, as they became called, was simply to stabilize international free market economies. Critics believed that the U.S. was trying to promote systems like their own abroad. Now, the Soviets were invited to join the Marshall Plan, but the Soviets believed that the free market systems of the West were incompatible with the communist socialist economic systems. The Cold War would subsequently become economic and political. And as far as the least industrialized areas of the world were concerned, so you look at Asia, Africa, and Latin American countries, a U.S. alliance meant development assistance, while an alliance with the Soviets means that you're going to get central planning, all right, you're going to get protection from international market forces, and prosperity via a socialist revolution. Now, the U.S. was in a much better position to aid their allies after the war because their economy expanded, while the Soviet economy and their nation was in desperate need of rebuilding. Entire factories were dismantled and moved from East Germany to Russia, and the Soviets relied on direct control. While the Americans used military strength, they used diplomacy and economic aid to assist their allies. Each side additionally expanded their intelligence operations during these early years. The Soviet KGB worked through local proxies to maintain control over their satellites and infiltrate the West, while the Americans created the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which was the first time that the U.S. had created a government agency for the purpose of gathering foreign intelligence. So the U.S. has definitely moved past their stage of isolation. The first job of the CIA was to pay Italian journalists to write negative stories about communist candidates for Italy's parliament. So they're using espionage, in effect, to try and stamp out the international presence of communism.